Kia ora koto katoa. Welcome to our 2021 Activist in Residence series, and I'm delighted to welcome Byron Clark as our next Activist in Residence. Byron is a Christchurch-based activist who has done significant work over the last 2 years, particularly documenting the presence and the effects of the far right in both digital and offline spaces here in Aotearoa, and particularly looking at the ways in which misinformation and conspiracy theories are circulated by the far right. His work has drawn significant attention to the ways in which far right works out and builds global networks. And he has himself negotiated threats from various far right individuals and groups for his activist work. Earlier, Byron had done an incredible the video essay on the Occupy movement in Aotearoa. I also would encourage you to watch that. So it really is my pleasure to welcome Byron with us. Welcome, Byron. So lovely
Yeah,
to have you.
thank you.
Great. Byron, perhaps we can begin by talking a little bit about your activism and how you got started with activism.
Well, I got started with activism when I was still in my teens, going along to anti-war demonstrations, protesting against the war in Iraq. I also, not long after that, got involved in the Unite Union and their Supersize My Pay campaign. And since then, I've been involved in a number of different campaigns and movements, both around like organised labour, like what I was doing with Unite at that point, um, as well as further anti-war activism. Um, the particular focus on the far right that I've had in more recent years has mostly come about following the Christchurch shooting. Although I had been on some of the large demonstrations against the National Front in 2004, 2005, when they were still the biggest far right presence in Aotearoa, which has changed a lot since then. It's now the landscape is quite different. And yeah, as you mentioned, another big thing I was involved in was the Occupy movement, which was sort of the globalization of Occupy Wall Street, which itself was inspired by other social movements like the Indignados in Europe, and before that, the Arab Spring in North Africa and the Middle East. And yes, I did an oral history project on that movement as well, recording interviews with the people who participated in Christchurch, so that would be documented for the future as something people can read about, learn about what went well with that movement, what could have been done better, something that can be a useful resource for activists in the future.
Mm. Fascinating. That seems like a wide arc in many ways, Byron. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about how you see the connections between, say, anti-war activism, labor-based activism, organizing against the consolidation of power in finance capital, and sort of anti-racist activism.
Mm. I think it all does relate together. Um, there's a quote, and I wish I could remember who it was from right now, but that we can't be single issue activists because we don't live single issue lives. So I do encounter all sorts of these things, and it's important to have a focus on all of them, even if primarily right now my focus is on the far right and disinformation. I think it definitely ties in a lot with particularly the anti-war activism that I started doing as a teenager, because I grew up in that post 9/11 environment um, that affected this country as much as it did other countries in the world, particularly the United States. And it was after that we really saw a rise in Islamophobia and the demonization of Muslims. And I think that an event like the shooting in Christchurch was in a lot of ways the culmination of an Islamophobia that had been growing for 2 decades prior to that, and had been encouraged by people who were in power.
So, this is really interesting because something you're outlining here is the role of the state, if you will, and particularly the imperial state in constituting the broader landscape within which this white supremacy plays out, and particularly Islamophobia plays out, isn't it?
Mm. Mm. Yeah, and even more broader than that, we often talk about white supremacy as an aberration from the norm, but of course, living in New Zealand is a white settler state, and a lot of what we now think of as white supremacist ideas were the unofficial ideology of the British Empire. And this country was colonized by people who believed that the indigenous population were an inferior race to them. So white supremacy has a long history, not just on the margins of politics, but actually in the center as well, as something that's pushed by the powerful.
Hmm. And also connecting back to 9/11, and I was in the US at that time, and I think one of the things that was most striking around the 9/11 response and then Operation Iraqi Freedom was the extent to which Islamophobia formed the fundamental tool of the security apparatus, if you will, or the security state, right? And then, I also then saw how that played out in terms of Zionist strategies of deploying Islamophobia, or Hindutva strategies of deploying Islamophobia. So, in that sense, it seems like a lot of these Islamophobic forces connect back to that 9/11 moment, don't they?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think another aspect of it was the belief in a kind of clash of civilizations between the West and Islam, which was very much promoted around that time, and that's the ideology that's believed by a lot of the far right, and also an ideology that is believed by a lot of Islamic extremists who believe there is this war of civilizations going on, but just see themselves as being on the opposite side of that war.
Mm. It's fascinating. So I would like to fast forward a little bit and connect it to sort of your anti-racist activism now. Would you like to talk a little bit about what you have been doing, and sort of what are the key things you're finding in your work?
Certainly. So I think I actually started paying a bit more attention to the far right even before the shooting in Christchurch, in around 2014, when the Gamergate controversy was happening, where a number of women working in the video game industry, either as developers or reviewers and so forth, were finding themselves victims of a lot of harassment from mostly men in that subculture. And then I saw with that develop into these online movements that could be organized to harass people, and it's been well documented now that people who we now think of as the alt-right, people like Steve Bannon, Milo Yiannopoulos, really captured that movement and saw, here's a large group of angry young men who we can influence with our ideas. And then you get things from that, like the campaigns originating on 4chan to spread disinformation or to harass individuals or groups. And you have the alt-right growing out of that and then influencing the 2016 American election to an extent. It's arguable how much influence that movement had, but definitely had some. So I was paying attention to it for those years as well. And then after the after the election of Donald Trump, still watching and reading about the far right, or the new far right, which was quite different from the like neo-Nazi skinhead gangs that were around when I was younger. So when the Christchurch shooting happened, and when pretty quickly afterwards we realised this was somebody who spent time in these online subcultures on 8chan, and was also being influenced by far right YouTubers like Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux. I had a lot of knowledge there in this area that I think a lot of people weren't that aware of unless they've been following it closely. So I wanted to get that information out to more people, and make it easy to understand and see what's happening there. So the first thing I did was start a YouTube channel where I would do video essays on some of these issues. So the first one I did was looking at the campaign against the UN Migration Compact, which we'll talk a bit about in the white paper that's being released later this week. And I looked at how this campaign was able to spread through social media, and influence even mainstream politics from there. And that was particularly relevant after the Christchurch shooting, because the shooter had written the words, "Here's your migration compact," on one of the weapons that he used to carry out that atrocity.
Wow. Something that I'm thinking through here is sort of your depiction of the online subculture of hate. And you talked about 4chan and 8chan. Do you want to explain for our audience a little bit what these subcultures are?
Yeah. So we'll talk a bit more about this tomorrow if people want to come along to that as well. But these subcultures have emerged really in the last 15 years or so, and they're made up largely of young men who are dissatisfied, partly for economic reasons. It's a generation who aren't getting the same opportunities perhaps as their parents' generation, where things like home ownership and a steady career aren't looking likely. So they are instead retreating into these private lives online, where they're spending a lot of time in video games and online forums like 4chan, which wasn't founded with any kind of racist ideology behind it. It was just founded as a discussion forum, mostly for talking about things these people were fans of, like anime and video games and so forth. But it also had an ethos of absolute freedom of speech with no censorship there. So people could come along and spread hateful ideas and start these, particularly once 4chan founded a sub forum for discussing politics called Politically Incorrect, which was very soon practically taken over by the far right. And if you had a different political ideology, you probably wouldn't want to go and talk about it there in this space where most people were pushing white supremacist or hateful ideology. And like I'd said before, when Gamergate happened, that was a lot of these young men who were angry at women in the industry, and particularly angry at feminism because they were blaming feminism for their own lack of success, lack of economic success. And because they had retreated into a world of video games, they saw feminist criticism of video games, or women trying to make new kinds of video games that maybe appeal to a broader audience, including young women. They saw that as an encroachment on their world. And then Gamergate came out of that. And it was when Steve Bannon, running the website Breitbart, which he described as a platform for the alt-right, realized that while most of the media were either ignoring this because it was happening often in unusual subculture, or trying to make sense of it, and much of the mainstream game press was condemning what was going on, because it was quite awful. There was harassment and threats made to some of these women, and a lot of their safety was actually at risk. So there was nobody really providing sympathetic coverage of Gamergate until Breitbart started doing it. They made Milo Yiannopoulos their technology writer who would write about this, and then he later would do these tours of university campuses where he would be, the word I sort of used to describe him a lot was provocateur, essentially go along and spread these dangerous ideas. And by dangerous, these were ideas that were outside of acceptable political discourse. But by doing this, by spreading this both online and offline through his tours, they were making a wider range of politics acceptable. And then when the 2016 election happened in the US, that further widened that window and made a lot of these ideas more acceptable. So we could have a serious candidate for president talking about banning all Muslims from entering the United States. Though I would add that also is a consequence of the Islamophobia in the post 9/11 years as well.
It's really interesting how you describe this subculture, Byron, because it seems like there is a materiality that underlies it in terms of um, the empirical everyday experience of disenfranchisement, the lack of social mobility, economic opportunity. And sort of on top of that, then sits this layer of how that is made sense of or interpreted. So, my question within that context is that, one would, coming from critical analysis, argue that that is the space that socialist movements need to take up. And yet, it seems like that point becomes the very point that catalyzes the far right, which fundamentally reproduces an ideology of economic inequality,
Yeah. And these groups of young men are economically marginalized in a lot of cases. Not, I don't want to say the entire far right is people from these economic circumstances, because there are some wealthy people there who are putting up the funding for things like Milo Yiannopoulos tours and the publishing of websites like Breitbart. But certainly the audience is made up largely of these economically marginalized young men who are being told that their marginalization is not their fault, but is the fault of feminism, of immigrants, of political correctness, or wokeness is the term they're using now rather than political correctness. And they're recruiting in that sense, getting people who are angry and perhaps justifiably angry, but pointing that anger at the wrong targets.
So, something else that you pointed out is how this new far right looks different from the old far right. So you brought up National Front. So if you want to use that as your point of comparison, what are the similarities and differences, you would say?
So there's a good article on this in the New Zealand context, written by Ben Ely and Jared Gilbert, called Shaved Heads and Sonorards, looking at the difference between the old far right of the National Front and the new far right, the new alt-right that exists now. When I was young, the far right were easy to spot because they would shave their heads and they would have often tattoos of a swastika or other symbols, and they operated more like gangs rather than a political movement. There were some efforts to try and bring them more into the mainstream by Carl Chapman in particular, who was a leader for a while. But they were never really very successful because I think people have a real aversion to people with swastika tattoos and people who are openly praising Nazism and doing Nazi salutes and so forth. Whereas the modern alt-right doesn't have a continuity with that, because it's made up very largely of a younger generation who weren't around for that time. And while they are promoting, very bigoted and hateful ideas, they're not, in most cases, they're not openly praising Nazism, and some of them will even say, no, we're not Nazis, the Nazis were socialists, that's left, we're something different. And I think that makes the strategies for fighting the far right different, because it was very easy when I was young to go along to a protest where on one side of the protest would be skinheads doing swastika salutes, and the other side would be a more diverse, more multicultural collection of activists protesting against them. Whereas now a lot of the alt-right don't necessarily look that way. They don't openly identify as Nazis or even fascists, and some of them don't even like to be called far right, and instead insist on being called patriots or conservatives or freedom fighters and so forth.
Mm-hmm. So, what does this landscape of alt-right look like in Aotearoa? That's a question we have from Matthew, who's saying, can you touch on the extent of the far-right group development and its existence in New Zealand?
Mm. Yeah, so as I was following what was going on in those sort of years like 2016, 2017, there were some attempts at starting a kind of new movement and moving from online to offline. There's a good article from 2017 by Kirsty Johnson that was published in the New Zealand Herald about how the alt-right wanted to intervene in the 2017 election. And she's spent a bit of time on 4chan and inside some of their closed Facebook groups, getting an idea of what was happening there. There were groups started like the Auckland University European Students Association, which was meant to be a group for European students, and again, like, they don't call themselves a white supremacist or a white nationalist group. They would say, oh, we're just for Europeans to celebrate European culture and European history. And there was briefly a website put up and posters put up around university campuses for a group called Western Guard, but that quickly amounted to nothing. There was a lot of discussion on 4chan about the media coverage of their posters, which I think is something Kirsty Johnson talks about in that article. But following that, we didn't really hear from that group again, and the Students Association group seemed to disappear as well. But we did see the emergence a bit later of the Dominion movement, who were a more explicitly alt-right group. That group went on a hiatus almost immediately after the Christchurch shooting. Within about half an hour, they'd announced on their Facebook page that they were going on hiatus. And I think the shooting probably spooked a few of the people who were involved. Perhaps some of them were afraid there would be growing police attention or attention from other organisations like SIS, GCSB, now that there'd been an alt-right terror attack, and possibly for some of them, they actually realised the seriousness of what they were getting involved in and saw that it wasn't cool or edgy to be a fascist. But not long after the Dominion movement went on hiatus, we had two other groups emerge. One of them, Action Zealandia, which was founded by people who had been in the Dominion movement, and another one called Wagas Christi, which was based mostly around the Manawatu, actually, and had an ideology of sort of mixing a lot of sort of fascistic beliefs with a strange traditionalist interpretation of Christianity, and a heavy emphasis on physical fitness and bodybuilding and things. And one of the people involved in that was Daniel Guy Waring, who had been involved in sort of far right skinhead groups earlier, and it had been arrested for defacing a church in 2010. So there's a little bit of overlap between the old far right and the new far right with people like that. That group also went on hiatus after one of their members was who was a serving soldier in the New Zealand Defence Force, was arrested and is now facing court-martial on espionage charges and some other charges. When that came out in the media that he was a member of that group, the group then seemed to fold. It's been revealed now that he is also a member of Action Zealandia, so there seemed to be a bit of overlap between those two groups. So that's the more openly fascist far right that exists in Aotearoa today. There's also the people who will balk at being called fascist or even being called far right, but there are a small number of influencers on YouTube who have got audiences of a few thousand people who, for the most part, from what I can gather, do seem to actually be based here. And then there's Facebook pages and Telegram groups that are based here. How many of them are far right groups really depends where you draw the boundary between what is far right. There's a lot of conspiracy theory content, particularly in the pandemic. A lot of conspiracy theories have come up around COVID-19 and particularly the COVID-19 vaccine. And there's some overlap between the far right and these conspiracy theory movements. Just today on Morning Report, they were interviewing Kate Hanna from the Disinformation Project, and she noted that there's that overlap there between white supremacy and climate change denial and these COVID conspiracy theories. So while not everybody in that conspiracy theory scene is necessarily part of the far right, it's an area where the far right are seeing fertile ground for recruitment, which is something we've seen overseas as well.
Fascinating. So it seems like if you look at the information ecosystem of misinformation, Byron, that there are some key narratives. For instance, that this is an United Nations conspiracy, or it's a global socialist conspiracy. So could you talk about the main sort of narratives that make up this infrastructure?
Yeah, so there's a few things that come up again and again, and the United Nations looms large in the imaginations of these people, as does often the Communist Party of China. One YouTube personality who I've talked about a bit in articles and videos is a man called Lee Williams, who has a channel called Cross the Rubicon. He laid out in a video that was posted there what the channel's values are, and his belief was that there is a global conspiracy by political Islam and cultural Marxism to emasculate Western men. Specifically, I think he's talking about white men there, to allow a invasion of Western nations with predominantly Islamic immigrants. So this is the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, and he's bringing in other ideas around threats to masculinity and to and a fear of brown men or black men coming into the West, which are very old racist tropes, but also ties in with a lot of that modern anxiety around feminism, around a growing visibility of the LGBT community. And they're just tying all of this in together and seeing feminism and the LGBT community and cultural Marxism and Islam. They're bringing all of these perceived enemies together into one grand conspiracy. And you see that, I think, in most of these groups. some of them emphasizing one part of it more than the other. Like, so some of them will particularly focus on Islam and be quite Islamophobic. Others will be more focused on the Communist Party of China and see them as being a large part of this conspiracy, or others might specifically look at feminism. And I should note there is still, as the far right is known for, there's still a great deal of anti-Semitism there. So a group like Action Zealandia believe similar things, but they see a Jewish conspiracy theory as behind it, rather than necessarily a Islamic or cultural Marxist one. They still believe the West will be flooded with Muslims, but they think that it's a Jewish conspiracy theory to do so.
As I'm sort of listening to you put together this narrative structure, what is really striking to me is the parallel with the Hindutva and the ideology of far right Indian nationalism. And even just recently, in response to my white paper on Hindutva, one of the accusations thrown in was that this is a cultural Marxist conspiracy funded by the Communist Party of China. And of course, tied in with the Islamist conspiracy as well. So it seems also that in many ways that these the far right forces converge. Do you want to talk about that convergence and how that is made possible?
The convergence between like the Western far right and Hindutva?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so like you've said there, and like we've talked about before a little bit, there's these very similar narratives. The narrative of a Muslim invasion, displacing the inhabitants of, whether that's the West or whether that's India, and the idea that it is a grand cultural Marxist conspiracy theory to do so. And I think we are starting to see a little bit of that common ground being found between some of the Western far right and Hindutva, to an extent that's been there for a while. One of the people who's really influenced the modern alt-right is the Italian philosopher Julius Evola, who's Steve Bannon's favorite philosopher and gets cited by him a few times. And he was a fascist thinker in mid-20th century Italy, but believed that Mussolini's fascism hadn't really gone far enough because it was too modern and not basing itself enough in traditionalism. And he drew a lot of his ideology on from Hinduism, and brought a lot of those ideas into his way of thinking. So I think some of the more intellectual parts of the alt-right are perhaps looking at some of that. There's the publishing house, Arctos Media, who publish Evola and translate into English, and have published Hindutva books as well, and similar things there. So I think there's those two strands coming together a little bit there. And in the New Zealand context, we've seen things like the television program Talanoa Sao, which was started by three former candidates for the New Conservative Party, which was described by a lot of media as being a far right party, because they were promoting things very close to some of these alt-right ideologies, and at one point even giving a platform to Lee Williams, who I mentioned, sharing his videos on their social media and so forth, though they've distanced themselves from him in more recent months. So the three former candidates, after the New Conservative Party didn't have a lot of success in the election, they've started this media platform, and that platform is on Upna Television, and the producer is somebody who we know is a supporter of a lot of Hindutva ideas and has connections with international BJP affiliated groups.
Mm.
So Yeah.
That's a fascinating link that you bring up, Byron, because it's the same producer, Roy Counts, who did a show on the CARE white paper and really
Oh, yeah.
shows up the Hindutva narratives. And there were activists subsequently that, in fact, pointed out many of his Islamophobic comments on social media. So, one of the things also within that context, which is interesting, is the linkage of these far right forces with Steve Bannon's media network. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, yeah. So something else that we've seen, I think, especially since the election last year, where there was attempts by some of these groups to participate in the election, whether that was through the New Conservative Party, or in the case of some of the more conspiracy theory orientated individuals through Advance New Zealand. But then not having much success in the election, there's been a real pivot to alternative media, and one of those is members of the New Conservative Party founding Talanoa Sao, but the other one has been Counterspin Media, which doesn't air on broadcast television but is on the streaming network GTV, which was founded by Steve Bannon and Miles Guo, or Guo Wingwei, who is behind an organization called the New Federal State of China, which is a anti-communist party of China organization, and Guo is a real estate billionaire from China who's now left China and has started his own political movement opposing the government there. But he's working closely with Steve Bannon, and one of the projects they've founded is GTV, which is known as being a platform for fake news and disinformation, so much so that if you share a GTV link on Facebook, it'll automatically be deleted and your account restricted there because it's so known for fake news. But the organization behind that has sort of branches in different countries of the world, calling themselves Himalaya Farms. So there's a Himalaya New Zealand that operates here, and they have offered a couple of people here the opportunity to do a weekly show, and so they do that on GTV, broadcasting from New Zealand, and they have had Roy Carnes on there as a guest, as well as other prominent figures in the sort of conspiracy theory far right space in Aotearoa.
And again, after you pointed me to it, I was watching some of the narratives there. And again, it's the same kind of disinformation that you touched on earlier, the notion of cultural Marxist conspiracy, the attack on critical race theory, as if that's going to take over. So any talk of social justice or inequality is a conspiracy. And, one of the interesting episodes there was the attack on the Hepuapua report. So do you want to talk about that a little bit in terms of how that connects then into the kind of activism against the Maori wards and Tetiriti and Maori sovereignty?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's unique to this country when it comes to the far right is their focus on opposing those sort of decolonization policies and any policy that seeks to address inequality between Pākehā and Māori. And you see this described as, often they describe it as apartheid, which is a way they say that they're not racist, they're opposed to apartheid, and this is another form of apartheid, which when you look at what these policies are and you look at some of the theory around decolonization, it's very much not what it is, but it is a way that these groups can stir up some anger among Pākehā New Zealanders. And again, I think maybe they're in the same way that things like Gamergate targeted marginalized young men. I think some of this stuff targets economically marginalised Pākehā and tells them that the enemy is iwi, and not focusing their anger on the economic system, but telling them that another group is getting something unfairly. So using this as a way to grow their influence and recruit people. And this is an ideology that I think it works because it ties back into, as I mentioned earlier, we're in a white settler state, and the supposed superiority of white people was an unofficial ideology of the British Empire. And it's only in the last maybe 50 years that we've really seen a decolonization movement, and we're starting to discuss some of these things more in the mainstream. So I think for a lot of Pākehā New Zealanders, particularly older generations, they do feel that this things like he puapua are unfair or unreasonable or a form of apartheid, which I think really misunderstands what apartheid was, because apartheid, of course, was the result of colonization in South Africa. So to talk of decolonization as apartheid is completely wrong. But if you have a very simplistic understanding of the politics, I think you can interpret things that way.
So, one of the things then that you do with your YouTube videos is deconstruct these narratives. So do you want to talk a little bit about how you go about setting up these videos? What is the form of these videos, and what do you seek to achieve through them?
So the main thing I seek to achieve is I want people to watch a video, and when they've finished watching, I want them to know more than what they knew before the video, or at least know a bit more that will encourage them to go and research a little bit more, or make inquiries further. I didn't want to do a YouTube channel where I just talk about my opinions, because I don't think my opinions are necessarily that interesting. I wanted it to be a more educational thing. So I will go away and do quite a bit of research for these videos. The series that I'm the videos I'm possibly most proud of are, I did a 3-part series looking at how the Christchurch shooter had been inspired by the perpetrators of the Bosnian genocide in the 1990s. So I read a lot into the history of that conflict, and made this video series looking at how an ideology had been created and constructed through politics, but also through media, that had led to a situation where a genocide against the Muslim population could happen. And then I looked at how we see that. You can look at that as a bit of a microcosm as to what happened in the West after 9/11, where we see an Islamophobic narrative being constructed through politics and through the wider popular culture, and how we could end up in a situation where we're having these Islamophobic terror attacks on Muslims in the West, following 20 years of an Islamophobic narrative being normalized. So I've got some good feedback for that series. A lot of people have said that they came away with more of an understanding of both that period of history and I guess the modern situation as well. So yeah, so that's the sort of thing that I try and do. And some of the more recent one I've done, looking at fake news in New Zealand, where I look a bit at Talanoa and their promoting of false information around vaccines. And I want to do more on that series, looking more at some of the things on Talanoa and also at Counterspin Media, looking at the new fake news environment that exists in Aotearoa now.
Now, one of the things also you have done quite effectively is in terms of your activism to deplatform some of these conspiracy theorists or proponents of hate. So how do you go about doing that work of deplatforming, and what does that look like?
So we'll talk a bit about this at the workshop on Thursday, and look at doing some examples of this. But a lot of it really is just reporting the content to the platforms that it's on, because you really need to be quite methodical in doing that. Some of these people are learning the ways to avoid being banned from platforms. A lot of them are on their second or third YouTube account, or their fourth or fifth Facebook account. So it's there are limitations to this as a strategy. But I think if you can deplatform someone and stop them spreading that hate, spreading that misinformation, that makes quite a big difference. And I think for a while, particularly before the shooting happened, there was an attitude of ignore these people, don't pay them any attention. And I don't think that was the right strategy, because I think while they were ignored, they were able to slowly grow to the point where some of these YouTubers have thousands of followers, and then people are finding that they're encountering friends or family members who've been influenced by this, and then struggling to pull them out of that rabbit hole they've fallen down. So I've been drawing attention to some of these people rather than just ignoring them. But in doing that, I've said, here's what these people are saying. Here's how you can go and report them to the platform. And in the case of Talanoa Sawa, which airs on television, I've encouraged people to even go to the Broadcasting Standards Authority, because there are standards around accuracy that need to be held up with anything that's broadcast on television.
Excellent. So let's talk a little bit about what that policy structure looks like at this point. So we have NetSafe, we have Broadcasting Standards Authority, we have Media Council. So, between these three structures, from a policy standpoint, do we have adequate mechanisms to address misinformation and hate speech?
I think there's a real limitation there, because these were all developed in a pre-social media era. So some of the content that you see on YouTube now, you'd never see on television. Someone like Lee Williams couldn't go to TVNZ or TV3 and say, I'd like to make a show about how the radical Islam and the cultural Marxists planning the Great Replacement. No TV station would give him a slot on television to make videos about that. Whereas on YouTube, it's just a matter of making an account and then filming these videos on a smartphone and pressing upload, and then they're there. So the standards that apply to television, to print media, to radio, none of that covers the social media space. And the area that is the policies that do exist in that space are the policies of the platforms, of Facebook, of YouTube, of whoever. And we've really seen that these platforms have created the policies and enforced them in a very ad hoc sort of way. They may be there, but they weren't always enforced. And it's only since the real growth of the alt-right and events like the January 6th riots in Washington, D.C., that we're starting to see some of these policies actually being enforced. And there is criticism there around, is this an overreach by these platforms to censor people? Is this cancel culture? Is this an attack on free speech? And I think there's some validity to having those arguments. I think there's a few things to look at there. There's a libertarian argument that these are private platforms, so that they can decide what content they will allow and not allow. There's also perhaps a more socialistic argument as well, whereas that if you look at the union that was formed by people who work for Alphabet, which is the parent company of Google and YouTube, they have released a statement after the January 6th insurrection that the platform is not doing enough to stop the spread of these ideas. And I think when you've got workers acting collectively and saying we don't want to build and maintain a platform for the spread of fascist ideas, I think you need to take that into account, as well as this notion of free speech, which isn't really about the right to be on a private platform having your ideas promoted. It's more about what the government can do to prevent you from saying something. And I think there's more serious discussion to have in that area. But we've never had absolute free speech. There's always been some restrictions there. There's restrictions on what can be broadcast on television, that it needs to be accurate is one of those restrictions there. So one thing that I think should be looked at, as well as the proposed laws around hate speech, is looking at whether these institutions like the Media Council and the BSA, whether they can also cover some of the content that is made by New Zealanders for a New Zealand audience, but is then published on platforms like YouTube and Facebook, and potentially even some of these platforms like GTV, whether Media Council or Broadcasting Standards could have some kind of jurisdiction over those. I'm not certain of what I'd like to see with that. I think it's an area that, in terms of policy, should be discussed and looked at.
And this hate speech, the regulation becomes really interesting, as we were discussing earlier, Byron, within the context of the question of power. We have also seen how Zionists, we are starting to see this with Hindutva forces, how they are quickly able to manufacture a narrative of, say, Hinduphobia in order to silence any dissent and critique of the forces of Hindutva at work. So it really has to be thought through in terms of how you're going to create a policy that enables those being marginalized to actually advocate for a media ecosystem that safeguards their health and well-being, vis-a-vis those in power that are perpetuating hate, to take advantage of that system in order to silence those voices.
Yes.
The one thing, Byron, you had also mentioned earlier was about the mainstreaming of this hate into politics. I would love to hear a little bit more from you about that, particularly in terms of how the hate moves from these digital spaces into mainstream politics.
Yeah, so that's something we really saw with the campaign against the UN Migration Compact, which I'll talk about in some more detail at the event tomorrow. But this was a campaign that was started by the far right in Europe, in particular the identitarian movement. There was a video made by Martin Sellner, who was a leader of that movement, which became the most watched German language video on the topic of the UN Migration Compact, and arguably had some influence on Austria then pulling out of that compact. And there were similar cases in some other European countries. And this campaign reached New Zealand as well. And there was a petition to Parliament against New Zealand joining the compact, which only got about 6,000 signatures. So not a huge amount, really, in a country of 5 million. But the campaign had this petition. They had misinformation being shared on social media. They organized their followers to call into talkback radio opposing the compact, and they had a number of rallies in the large cities in New Zealand. And as a result of doing all of this, first some minor right-wing parties adopted their position, the New Conservative Party and then the ACT Party, who just had a single MP at that time. But then the National Party adopted a position of opposition to the UN Migration Compact. And so we saw how, while the far right are a very small group, they can potentially get some of their ideology into mainstream politics by doing these sort of activist things that are not dissimilar to what left-wing activists would be doing to try and influence policy, and they can then widen the window of acceptable political discourse and debate and get more mainstream organizations on board. So we had, like, one example of that was Judith Collins tweeting that New Zealand mustn't cede its sovereignty to the United Nations, which was never something that the United Nations Migration Compact was going to do. It was really about enforcing already existing international law around a person's human rights when they cross a border without the proper documentation. And it came out of the refugee crisis of 2015 and was very much a response to that. But the false narrative that the far right were pushing was that the United Nations was going to then be able to determine immigration policy for sovereign states, and this got tied into the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, the belief that majority white nations would be flooded with immigrants from the majority world, and that moved from the fringes right to the corridors of power, with the National Party adopting that. And as I've talked about as well, there was a minor scandal after the Christchurch shooting when the National Party immediately removed their petition against the compact from their website as a response to the shooter having "Here's your migration compact" written on his gun. And I think it's really important that they're held accountable to that they adopted this campaign, probably knowing full well that the narrative being pushed was not correct. I mean, Judith Collins is a lawyer. She was, I think, president or vice president of the Law Society. She would have been able to read the compact and know that it wasn't going to rob New Zealand of its sovereignty, but was still tweeting that New Zealand shouldn't give up its sovereignty. So I think there's some disingenuous behaviour from politicians there that they need to be held account for as well.
Mm-hmm. So, within this context, what are the roles of mainstream media, Byron, to interrogate some of these narratives?
Yeah, I think the media has a role in addressing these narratives when they come up. I think there's been even within the media a bit of a tendency to ignore some of these groups and these campaigns so as not to spread their messages further. I don't think that's always the right approach. I think it's a decision that needs to be made. In a lot of cases, it's useful that if somebody is going to encounter misinformation, that the first place they encounter it is a reputable individual or reputable media source explaining why it is misinformation and why it is false. This is sometimes referred to as pre-bunking. Like debunking comes after the fact, where you have to disprove something. Pre-bunking is when you give somebody the tools that when they encounter misinformation, they will be really knowing that it's misinformation there. This is something Jess Princeton Shaw has talked about a bit. I think there's also a problem sometimes in media of false balance, where they feel that they need to get two sides of a story. There was a New Zealand Herald article recently covering the fact that Action Zealandia is on Facebook's list of banned organisations, that not only are they not allowed on the platform, but you're not allowed to praise them on the platform. And when the New Zealand Herald covered this, they went out and got some quotes from Action Zealandia and then printed those. And I guess that was out of the idea of getting a balance and talking to both sides. I don't think that it's good journalism to get both sides of the story when one side of the story is a white supremacist group. I think it would have been better for them to, instead of getting a quote from the white supremacist group, talk to some experts on terrorism, on misinformation, on that sort of thing, and tell that story instead of a both sides narrative where Facebook is one side and white supremacists are the other side. So I think that's a problem too.
Thank you. I'm going to go to a comment from Laura, and I think this is a really interesting comment that she makes regarding cancelled material. And she says that some people see cancelled material as even more valid because they don't want us to see the truth, you know. So, in that sense, would love to see how you respond to this.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely something that happens there. I think deplatforming some of this material is going to result in it getting seen by less people. So if something disappears from Facebook, like a Facebook page may have only had 1,000 followers, but those followers, if they are then sharing the content, they're getting it out to a few hundred more each who are not necessarily on board with the far right and may not even realize that this misinformation is coming from there. So by deplatforming them, you are limiting the spread of that misinformation. But for the 1,000 people who were already following the Facebook page, those people might be the ones who see the page being deplatformed as making the material even more valid, and may then follow the creator of that page to a new platform like Telegram, and then it's going to be harder for the misinformation to spread further from there. It's going to stay quarantined in that what's sometimes called alt tech space. So it's going to be just on Telegram, away from more mainstream social media, where it could spread further and where it could be diluted to the point that people don't realize the misinformation is coming from the far right, which I think happened to an extent with the UN Migration Compact, to use one example. I think the other aspect of it, though, is people seeing the cancelled material as more valid because they don't want us to see the truth. That's if somebody who's already committed to a conspiratorial worldview where they see cultural Marxism and the radical Islam as being behind this grand conspiracy. It's hard to convince them that something being deplatformed isn't just proof that it was the truth that's trying to be hidden. At the workshop on Thursday, I think we're going to have some space for discussion around talking to those people and getting through to those people. Another aspect of it, though, is with a lot of these conspiracy theories and misinformation, there are groups in society who have quite legitimate reasons to be distrustful of the government. So we see in a lot of the anti-vaccine misinformation, specifically targeting Maori and Pacifica, and these groups who have experienced things like colonization or the oppression that Pacifica people have experienced from the government here, with things like the Dawn raids and so forth, that they may have very good reason to be distrustful of the state and of official narratives that are coming from the state, and may be more susceptible to being brought in by some of these conspiracy theories. And I didn't note explicitly, but Talanoa Sao is a Pacifica program with Pacifica hosts who are all pushing a new Conservative Party style worldview and pushing a lot of anti-vaccine misinformation as well. But some of the people who are watching that will be trusting them perhaps than they trust a government source. And I think getting through to those people and being able to provide the correct information is harder than just having the correct information available. And I think depends a lot on people who are leaders in those communities challenging the misinformation. So I think with Talanoa Sao is a good example. I can criticize them, but they can easily turn around and claim that I'm criticizing them because I'm Palangi and they are Pacifica, and they've done so when I've written about them. I think I think it's important to have Pacifica leaders talking about misinformation in that community, and at the same time for Maori leaders to be talking about the spread of misinformation in that community and addressing that. It's very important that we platform those voices that are going to be critical of the people who are spreading misinformation.
Mm. Also, there is something quite striking here, Byron, that these sort of white supremacists planting these forms of misinformation would be targeting, like, say, the with the vaccine conspiracy theories, that they would be targeting the Maori and Pacifica communities. And sort of, when you try to locate that within the context of their great replacement theory narrative, that actually suggests there's quite a strategic thinking behind this.
Mm. Yeah, it's hard to know exactly why why some of these communities are being targeted with that misinformation when it's coming from white supremacists. Um, you see some of the same people who are making those criticisms of Hipuapua and treaty settlements and Maori language, also then producing anti-vaccine misinformation and encouraging their followers to spread that to Maori communities where they think it'll get an audience. So there's a bit of almost cognitive dissonance in there among some of the far right who are spreading those ideas. And Lee Williams is an example where he would be making these videos about Hipuapua and things, and always clarify that he's talking about the elite Maori, not the average Maori. And I think it's very useful for a lot of these people if they can get people who are Maori, who are Pacifica, to be presenting some of the same ideas, because it gives them a bit of a shield from criticism if they've got somebody who's not white presenting that idea or that misinformation. So one example would be Elliot Ekeley, who was at the time the deputy leader of the New Conservative Party, after the Christchurch shooting, has stated several times that he doesn't believe that the shooter was a white supremacist. And there's been a real effort on some of the far right to distance themselves from the shooter and claim that he wasn't one of them, that they're not a violent movement. And I think that it's helped their narrative a lot to have someone like Elliot Ekeley spreading the idea that he wasn't a white supremacist. It hits a bit differently than when it is these white YouTubers claiming that he wasn't a white supremacist. So I think there's a strategy there that they're employing.
So, we are moving toward wrapping up, Byron. It's been such an excellent conversation. I want to turn to sort of this question of the personal costs and negotiations of risks while doing this work. I came across a story that pointed to the ways in which you have been targeted for drawing attention to these sources of misinformation and hate. So, would you like to talk a little bit about what's happened, and then what are the kinds of strategies we have followed to respond to that?
Yeah, so almost immediately, I think, when I started making these videos, I started to get targeted by the far right. One of the first comments I got on my first video essay was that I painted a target on my back and I better watch out, something along those lines. I'd get various sort of harassing comments that were really childish bullying type things that I just didn't really pay any attention to. It did escalate after somebody who I later found out was somebody who was involved with Action Zealandia had followed me home from an event that I was at in order to get my home address, and then shared that online with a number of people. And I was getting, as I mentioned, Lee Williams making a video about me, and then that address that I was at the time being shared in the comments, and I would then get death threats and other violent threats that noted they knew where I lived. I also had the address shared by followers of a Facebook page that I'd drawn some media attention to after the person who operates that page had made a threat about destroying mosques, and I would get people printing out things from that Facebook page and putting them in the letterbox just to make it clear that they knew where I lived and that they'd been there. So I did unfortunately have to get police involved in that, and for a while that house that I had been living in at the time was on their rapid response list for if somebody called 111. But thankfully the threats never amounted to anything more than threats, and I think that a big part of it was intimidation rather than actually planning to go through with harming me. I think that the idea was not to cause harm to come to me so much as it was to make me decide to stop making videos, to stop writing articles, to stop talking about these people and these issues. And I think that it wasn't even just targeting me; it was making it clear to my audience and to other people as well that this is what will happen if you speak out against these people. You will find yourself being a victim of threats and harassment and sharing of private information like your address and so forth. And I think one of the best ways that I've responded to that is by not stopping, by just showing that this isn't going to stop me from talking about these issues and the individuals and the groups that are spreading these hateful ideas. And if anything, I think drawing attention to the fact that these groups are or their followers are making threats against critics of the alt-right movement is not going to be a positive thing for them. I think it's going to show that as much as these people want to be seen as just conservatives or patriots or whatever, they are actually part of a movement that is potentially quite violent, as much as they try and distance themselves from people like the Christchurch shooter. That is something that we keep seeing, and I think part of the reason that I've received less threats and things over the past year is because they realise that the figureheads who aren't the ones making the threats themselves, but I certainly had been subtly encouraging it, are realising that it's a bad look for them if their followers are doing this.
That's really interesting. So it seems like that the figureheads that encourage the followers to do this often are or might be invisible, right? Or might actually so not easily be accessible to a viewer. So how do you make these figureheads visible?
Yeah, so in that one example where Lee Williams had made a video about me, and in the video he doesn't call for any harm against me or call for anyone to threaten me, but he did imply that either myself or people associated with me would aim to harm him in some way, and he talked about like violent Antifa and this is what's going to happen. And then when one of his followers posted what was then my home address in the comments of the video, he left it up there for about 4 hours. And so when that happened, I was quick to draw attention to it, like, this comment has been left on Lee Williams' YouTube channel and he hasn't deleted it. And then being on Twitter an hour later, it's been an hour and he still hasn't deleted it. I know that he's seen it because he's commented on, replied to other comments from that time, and so on, and making it really clear and public that this is where this is coming from, that the threats I'm getting aren't random. It happened right after this video was made and after this information was shared. And I think some of the people sending me threats interpreted that as me being frightened and panicking, and that I'd be tweeting often with screenshots and things and pointing this out. Whereas it wasn't about panicking, it was about documenting all of that and making that line clear from where that started and where it was leading to, for not just for any potential police investigation, but also as a matter of public record. Like, this is what is happening to me, and also in that, I guess making it clear to my followers that this is how they operate, and be aware of this if you're wanting to be a very public critic of what they're doing. Because I think some of the people who are watching my YouTube channel or following other things I do, maybe feel a bit inspired by what I do. But I want people to be aware that while there is definitely positive things that come from this, like the opportunity to do this residency, for example, there is that side to it where there are these risks as well. And I think anyone who wants to be publicly doing this needs to be aware of the risks. Although I think there's a lot of ways to be doing this kind of activism without being so publicly exposed. And I think the reporting content that we talked about, that we're going to do the workshop about, that makes a big impact in stopping the spread of hate and disinformation. But a lot of the people who are doing that are anonymous or are largely invisible, and often I hear of a Facebook page being removed or a YouTube channel getting a 2-week ban or something, and I see people in the Telegram groups blaming me for it. And it's quite funny, because often I wasn't even aware until I'd seen in Telegram that it had been banned, and it's that other people have been going in and reporting this content, and then it's been restricted. And often I don't have enough time to be watching every YouTube video that these people produce and reporting it. But there are other people who do that, and they do that work. They do that work largely silently and anonymously, but it's really important work as well. It's as important as the more public facing stuff that I do.
Lovely. Last question, Byron. What are the kinds of things you would like to see happen in the next couple of years?
I'd like to see the social media platforms taking more responsibility for the content that's on their platforms. I think we've started to see that, but it's been slow, and it's taken a lot to get there. So we saw after the January 6th riots in Washington DC, Twitter immediately purged the platform of a number of the accounts that have been supporting the QAnon conspiracy theory, including a small number of New Zealand-based accounts. And I think that was a positive action, but it was one that it took this riot where 5 people died before Twitter took that action. And in a similar way, a lot of the social media platforms did very little until after the Christchurch shooting, until we had the Christchurch call. And I think that's really only a starting point as well, because that's focused largely on actual terrorist content, like the live streaming of the massacre that was on Facebook, and dealing with that aspect to it. But there's also everything that comes before the atrocity. It's the hate and the misinformation. And I think that more could still be done by social media platforms to be stopping that. I think that's not going to be the only solution, though, because there are people who will always push up against the envelope of what is not allowed on these platforms, but never quite cross the line and get to remain there. We'll see more of that. We'll see some of these alt tech platforms becoming more of a space for this stuff to spread. So we need a lot more as well. I think we need people to be more aware of misinformation and disinformation, expect that they're going to encounter that, and how to critically assess what they're reading, what they're seeing, to know whether it is truthful or not. And like we've touched on a bit, it would be good to see if anything can be done in terms of policy around having the media council covering some of this stuff on social media as well, because I don't know how much faith we can put in the platforms to properly deal with this content. And also the platforms being private corporations don't have a lot of accountability, whereas when it's something like Media Council or BSA, as they are public institutions, there is a bit of public accountability there. So that's an aspect to that as well. And what I'd also like to see is more research being done on the far right and on disinformation, because I don't think it's something that's going to go away anytime soon. So I think there need to be those resources there for research to be conducted and carried out, and reporting to be done. And in the media, there's some good journalists who are covering this, and but I think there's space for there to be more, particularly as we're seeing that disinformation can have an enormous effect on our society, with things like the January 6th riot in the States, or with things like the impact of the disinformation campaign against the UN Migration Compact. I think it's something that it would be good to have more media looking at more in depth, rather than just reporting sort of after things have happened about misinformation, but looking at how these networks are operating and how it's spreading.
Wow. Thank you so much, Byron, for really sharing this time with us and walking us through your journey of activism, how you see online disinformation and hate, the kinds of immediate strategies that can be adopted, as well as the long-term strategies. Before we wrap up, is there anything that you would like to add?
No, I think we've covered a lot, but I'd encourage people who are watching this to come along to the next few things as well if they're wanting to learn more, because it's a big topic, and there's more that will be covered in those events.
Thank you so much, Byron. It's been such a joy having you with us. I'm looking forward to the next few days and really working on our white paper. So, for our audience, Byron was referring to our upcoming events. We have a public talk by him that is tomorrow. You can find that on the CARE Facebook page. We also have a workshop that he's going to do on specific strategies for reporting and deplatforming. That will be very helpful probably for a lot of us. And then we are going to release our white paper on Friday and talk about the specific aspects of strategies and solutions. So once again, it's a delight to have you with us, Byron, and thank you for joining us to listen to this interview, and look forward to having you, our audience, for the rest of this week.
Great, thank you.